Greetings, Remnant, and welcome to this week's Midweek Refuel, where we break open the old Christian literature to better understand our current spiritual warfare. I'm Pastor John Widdifield, and it is a joy to have you with us. Please, if you would, take a moment and help us out. Punch the like button and the subscribe button. This week, we will be looking at the first book, the first chapters of Book 7 of Augustine's Confessions. This is not a simple chapter by any stretch of the imagination. It's an extremely dense, rich, and theologically challenging chapter. Augustine gets into the origin of evil, the substance or the non-substance of God, and then that touches upon ontology, theodicy, and the existence and vindication of God. And you and I both know God doesn't need vindication, but whenever the topic of evil in the universe and how it got into the universe is posed, one must first tackle the question of God's fitness to be God. So we're getting into dangerous territory, and Augustine himself realizes that the territory he's getting into is indeed dangerous. If you haven't thought it out, then let me shake your faith just a little bit. Please stop this video if you don't want to tackle these issues. Some might be better off left without it. Sometimes ignorance is indeed bliss. That being said, if God is all-powerful, if God is all good, if God is all present, then how in the world did evil enter into the world? And how did one of his greatest creations, an archangel, commit evil in the first place? If evil is not a figment of the imagination or some insanity that mankind has had since its origin, and if it is indeed opposed to God, then believing that God created it does indeed take some mental gymnastics that most of us would feel naturally dishonest about. And so should some of the theologians throughout time. It also causes some mental dissonance to buy into the idea that God was an active agent and creator of evil. We're stepping into very dangerous territory. The most shaking thing that I ever heard a theologian say, and I forget who it was that said it, but I do remember the words, and the words were these: "The devil is God's devil." Now let that sink in for a bit. It must be that way. The other alternative is Gnosticism, and that system, its utter horizon is to be avoided. The devil did not create himself. Christianity is not a dualistic religion, as symbolized in the yin and the yang. Christianity is not a dualistic religion. Zoroastrianism is, Mithraism is, the one that I just mentioned previous to all of that. Christianity is not. And a dualistic religion is one in which two forces of equal and opposite intensity create the polarization through which space-time and consciousness can exist. While the yin-yang is a very interesting symbol and worthy of some thought, it is not an accurate representation of the Christian concept of good versus evil. In the Christian concept, God is all-powerful. If he is all-powerful, then he must also be all-culpable, right? An incredible theologian named Plantinga, I highly recommend everything he writes, has actually solved this problem once and for all. I highly recommend his work, God, Freedom, and Evil. His work, again, is entitled God, Freedom, and Evil. And if you can handle it, it's well worth it. His argument is far too complex to go over here with any detail. His work is not for the faint of heart. There is another theologian that I like, but for the life of me, I can't remember his name. I really wish I could. John, I believe, is his first name, but I forget his last name. It's a short name. He put forth an idea that I really find compelling about God and creation and good and evil. What he implies is, if I remember correctly, is that our problem with God's design is simply that we cannot fathom the design goal of such a giant and complex system as the universe. A system that includes free will, a system that we are inherently a part of and therefore cannot see in totality or make proper judgments on. A system that includes free will and yet also a system which will terminate at the proper horizon, no matter what free will agent decisions are being made by its limited number of sentient beings, both physical and spiritual. While being admittedly a simplistic example, I find the following to be helpful in understanding this. We like to think God created Eden for us to stay in and have some hedonistic and relaxed lifestyle. But what if the fall has always been part of the plan? What if God created everything, you, me, the devil, and good and evil, so that sentient beings could be hard-pressed on every side by moral choices every moment, and that constantly, in order to refine these beings into creatures which will be able to actually survive eternity? What if you and I must be assaulted on all sides by moral fire in order for our imperfections to be burned off so that what remains might last eternity? The Bible speaks this way several times, doesn't it? With refiner's fire, a potter's wheel. The Bible tells us again and again that we are being perfected. We are like an ore that is getting the dross off of it. If we expect perfection without a little bit of pain, then we probably think we can lose weight without diet and exercise. Augustine begins to understand the futility of his own thoughts when it comes to God thinking or theology. He writes, quote, "So it was that I had grown dense-hearted and hidden even from myself, thinking that whatever did not have some degree of spatial extension or diffusion or densification or tumescence or some such was a complete nothing," unquote. In other words, Augustine was bound to think of the world through the material lens that he was familiar with, that we all become familiar with in our zeitgeist and in our cultural moorings. If it exists, then it must exist with permission of Augustine's limited capacity. That's where he's at, and that's where most atheists are at. That's where materialists are at. If it exists, then it must exist with permission of my mind. When you get into a spiritual argument with someone who has yet to see spiritually, you are really casting your pearl before swine. They don't have the glasses to look at what you're trying to point out. Look how Augustine himself, the great man of the church, the great teacher to the church, the great pastor, look how that man himself treats and thinks of the Church of Christ before his encounter with the Word of God. Even Augustine believes Christians to be intellectually bankrupt or worse. And yet, the more he actually pays attention to the argument, the more he allows the Word to shape him instead of him shaping the Word, the more his mind opens up to the spiritual reality that is all around him. Which makes a whole lot of sense. If the Word is a revealed Word and not a man-written Word, then that Word comes from outside of us and acts as arbiter and lawgiver from on high, reality definer, order from chaos maker. It is the light, not the object in need of light. Allow the Word to cast its light on your intellect instead of trying to use your intellect to enlighten the Word of God. That is not how it works. We will actually get to the point in the book a few weeks down the road where this situation of the Word being illuminating light begins to manifest itself in the life of Augustine. Listen to the heartfelt cry of Augustine as all of this lands upon him. He writes, quote, "What then is the origin of my willing bad deeds, not willing good ones? Why I should just pay the penalty for my deeds? Who was it that said and planted this bitter plant in me, seeing as I came into being entirely from my God, the supreme sweetness? Unquote. This reminds me of the scene in A Christmas Story when the main character, Ralphie, tries to blame his parents for all his shortcomings. It was the soap. Augustine asked himself the question that all of us have asked ourselves if we have troubled to think about sin at all. Why am I coded with not only the ability to sin, but also the seeming inability not to? If I was designed, then I have to question the design philosophy behind this, what I think of as awkward birth. Rebirth, forgiveness of sins, everything. And then we run into the same horrible situation that Augustine fears falling into. He writes, and listen, quote, "These anxious thoughts dragged me down and choked me again and again, but I was never brought to that abyss of error in which no one confesses you, of thinking that you suffer evil rather than that man commits it." Unquote. There are logical conclusions about God that cause all of us to pause when thinking certain things about God. It's a warning system. It is as though we know enough about Him to fear accusing Him of something horribly untrue. It is as though we understand that to think of God improperly doesn't hurt Him, it hurts us. To think of God improperly causes our own soul's damage while leaving Him completely unscathed. And that is a very frightening realization when you first truly understand it. Theology is important. Orthodoxy is important. Proper teaching and the rejection of false teaching and false doctrine is important. Let's turn to chapter 1 of book 7, and we're going to read through chapter 3, and let's hear what Augustine has to say. "By now, my youth, evil and shameful as it had been, was dead, and I was entering my full manhood. And the older I was in years, the more riddled I was with vanity, inasmuch as I could not conceive of a substance except as the sort visible to our bodily eyes. I had not conceived of you, O God, in the figure of a human body since I first gave heed to wisdom. This conception I always shunned. And I now rejoice that I found that this was the teaching of our spiritual mother, your Catholic Church. But it was not immediately apparent how else I should conceive of you. I, a man, and what manner of man, attempted to form a conception of you, the highest and one true God. And in my deepest being, I believed on trust that you were incorruptible, inviolable, and unchangeable, as I did not know how or why. This, however, I saw clearly and did not doubt that the corruptible is worse than the incorruptible. Without hesitation, I held that the inviolable was preferable to the violable, and that what suffered no change was better than that which could be changed. My heart cried out violently against all my illusions, and I endeavored with one blow to drive from my mind's sight the buzzing crowd of impurities that hovered around me. But scarcely had it been dispersed when in the twinkling of an eye it gathered again and assailed my vision and clouded it, so that although I did not conceive of you in the figure of a human body, I was none the less compelled to think of you as something corporeal, with spatial extension, either infused through the universe or diffused even outside the universe through infinite space, something indeed incorruptible, inviolable, and unchangeable, which I regarded as better than one corruptible, violable, and changeable, but still a something. For whatever I deprived of this sort of spatial extension seemed to me to be a nothing, a complete nothing, not even a void, such as when a body is removed from a place and the place remains evacuated of all body, earthly, moist, aerial, or heavenly. But there is nevertheless a place that is void, as it were a nothing, but with spatial extension. So it was that I had grown dense-hearted and hidden even from myself, thinking that whatever did not have some degree of spatial extension or diffusion or densification or tumescence or some such was a complete nothing. My heart was proceeding through images of the same sort as the forms through which my eyes were accustomed to proceed. Nor did I see that the mental focus by which I formed those images was itself not something of the same sort, even though I believed that it could not form these images were it not a something with magnitude. Thus I conceived even of you, life of my life, as permeating through infinite space in every direction the whole fabric of the universe, and outside it, as extending through measureless distances without end. Earth, I thought, contained you. Heaven contained you. All things contained you and had their end in you, but you had no end anywhere. Just as the physical mass of the air above the earth does not obstruct the sunlight and prevent it crossing it and penetrating it, not that the sunlight pushes or shears through the air, but fills it completely. So, I thought, the mass not only of heaven and air and sea, but even of earth were permeable to you and penetrable from their greatest parts to their least, so as to contain your presence within through your hidden inspiration and without through your governance of all your creation. This was my surmise, for I could make no other conception, and it was false. For in that way, a greater part of the earth would contain a greater part of you, and a lesser part a lesser. Although all things would be full of you, more of you would be contained in the body of an elephant than of a sparrow, in proportion as it was bigger and occupied a bigger place. According to this theory, you would make the parts of you present bit by bit, with large parts of you in large parts of the universe and small. This is not so. But you had not yet lightened my darkness. What I found enough, O Lord, to refute those deceivers who are themselves deceived, who speak so much and say so little, seeing as they do not speak your word. What I found enough was a question that Nebridius had asked many times ever since we were in Carthage, shaking to the core all of us who heard it. What, he asked, of the race of darkness, derived from the opposing mass, which the Manichees habitually pit against you. What would they do to you if you declined to fight them? If the Manichees replied that they would inflict harm upon you, then you would be violable and corruptible. If, however, they said that they could not inflict any harm upon you, they could offer no reason why you should fight them, and fight them in such a way that a portion of you, a limb of yours, or an offspring of your very substance should become involved with these hostile powers, these beings not created by you, and be so much corrupted and changed for the worse by them, that from a state of blessed happiness it should pass to misery, needing help in order to be rescued and made clean. This offspring, say the Manichees, is the soul whom your logos, free, pure, and incorrupt, succors in its servitude, pollution, and corruption. But the logos, too, is corruptible, being of one and the same substance. If, therefore, they say that you, whatever you are, that is to say your substance through which you exist, are incorruptible, then all of what they say is false and exasperable. If, however, they say that you are corruptible, that is itself false, and should be abjured as soon as it is uttered. This question, then, was enough against the Manichees, fit as they were in every way to be spewed out of my overcharged stomach. They had no way of escaping that question without committing a horrible sacrilege of the heart and the tongue, thinking such things about you and speaking them. But even then, although I declared and firmly believe that you are incapable of pollution or transformation and unchangeable in any part, our God, the true God, who have made not only our souls, but also our bodies, and not only our bodies and souls, but all bodies and all souls, I did not consider that I had unraveled and solved the question of the origin of evil. I saw, however, that whatever its origin, I would have to approach the question in such a way as not to be constrained to believe that the unchangeable God was changeable. In asking what was the origin of evil, I would have to be careful not to become evil myself. Thus I asked the question without anxiety, certain that what the Manichees said was not true, for in my heart I was in full flight from them, seeing that when they inquired into the origin of evil, they were themselves full of evil thoughts, inasmuch as they supposed that your substance was more likely to suffer evil than their own to commit it. I applied my mind to understanding what I was hearing, namely, that free will was the reason why we commit evil, and your righteous judgment, the reason why we suffer it. But I could not understand it as it was. Therefore, as I endeavored to raise my mental sight from the depths, I was dragged down again, and often as I tried, I was drawn down again and again. What raised me up towards your light was the fact that I knew that I had a will just as much as I knew I was alive. Thus, when I willed or did not will something, I was wholly certain that it was I and no one else who was willing it or not willing it. And I was now on the point of perceiving that therein lay the reason for my own sin. As for the evil I did against my will, I saw that I was suffering it rather than committing it, and adjudged it not so much my guilt as my punishment. Conceiving of you as being just, I was swift to acknowledge that I was not being punished unjustly. But once again I said, who made me? Was it not my God? And is he not only good, but the good itself? What then is the origin of my willing bad deeds and not willing good ones? Why I should justly pay the penalty for my deeds? Who was it that set and planted this bitter plant in me? Seeing as I came into being entirely from my God, the supreme sweetness. If the devil is responsible, what is his origin? But if the devil himself changed by his perverse will from being a good angel to being the devil, what is the origin of the evil will by which he became the devil? Seeing as he was made holy an angel by the supremely good Creator. These anxious thoughts dragged me down and choked me again and again, but I was never brought to that abyss of error in which no one confesses you, of thinking that you suffer evil rather than that man commits it. The chapters today are extremely dense and extremely difficult. I didn't even begin to scratch the surface of them in this lesson. Had I, we would have needed time for a complete seminar and maybe a week to do it. The topics that we are starting to approach are high-level theology. I encourage you to seek out rich theology. I encourage you to learn how to read rich theology and how to understand it. The exercise of thinking about God properly is healthy. It stretches the mind up past the simple and limited material reality that is presented to our senses and engages our soul and imagination in ways which redefine reality according to the roadmap that has been given to us in the Word. It is a light unto my path. We do this because Christ is King. Hail to the King.